shrouded in darkness. Chaos is all we see. Violence, oppression, and destruction surround us. No matter how dark the situation becomes, we are reminded of these two words: but God. But God won't let our hearts be troubled. The storm is raging on, but God will calm the sea. The enemy is attacking, but God will overcome. In this life we will have many tribulations, but God will have the last word. God is not done.
Well, good morning and welcome to Christ.Church. It's so good to see you here today. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 42. If you have your Bibles, your workbooks, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 42. As we continue through the book of Genesis, we continue through the life of this guy by the name of Joseph. Now, this week was a busy week for me. I jumped in the car. I had meetings down in South Florida, down in Fort Lauderdale, Miami area on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday morning. And then I had to be in Tallahassee by Wednesday night and into Thursday morning. And so my truck was in the shop getting some work done. And so we rented a car. And Ann and I jumped in the car. We loaded up and we started heading down 95 South. As I'm driving down 95, I started to notice something was different about this car. That every time I started to try to change lanes, or every time I drifted a little bit, all of a sudden my steering wheel would start to vibrate. And little lights would come on my dashboard, and then the car would self-correct, it would auto-correct and move me back where I'm supposed to be. And I'm going, what's going on here? You see, I don't have a smart car. I drive a 23-year-old truck. The only thing smart in the car is the driver, and on some days, he's not real smart either. And so the reality is like, I'm not used to this. And so I'm going down 95, heading south, and I am fighting with this car as it's trying to pull me one way, and I'm starting to talk to this car because I don't like to not be in control. If I'm in a car, I want to be in the driver's seat. Anybody feel me on that one? Anybody else? All right, good. Don't put me in the passenger seat. That's the worst place to put me. You can put me in the back seat. I'll be a passenger princess all day long back there. But don't put me shotgun. Don't put me in the navigator seat because I am not going to be in a good place. Because I want my hands on the steering wheel. I want my foot on the gas or on the brake. I want to be in control of where I am going. And I think that statement is just the key statement. I want to be in control. Anybody else want to be in control? Turn to the person on your right and say, I want to be in control. Turn to the person on your left and say, I want to be in control. Now, they're probably nodding at you going, I know you do. I know you do. Well, here I am, and I'm driving down 95, and I'm arguing with this car, fighting this car, as it's trying to self-correct, get me back where I'm supposed to go. And I had enough of it. And so finally, I just succumbed. I said, you know what? I am done. And I disabled it. I turned it off. I'm like, I am not doing this for 1,400 miles. And so we've been looking at the life of this guy, Joseph, and we've seen that there is an upper story and a lower story, and Joseph's lower story is a mess so far. I mean, his lower story is tough. He's got a dad, Jacob, who treats him as the favorite, gives him this honor of being the firstborn. He gets a coat. He gets a double portion. He gets to lead the family business. His brothers are envious. His brothers don't like him. In fact, the word hate is used. They beat him up. They throw him in a pit. They sell him into slavery, where he goes and he works for a guy by the name of Potiphar, and he gets falsely accused for putting the moves on Potiphar's wife. He gets thrown in prison and literally forgotten for a decade. I mean, this guy's life is tough. This guy's life is difficult. You look at his lower story, you're going, man, what's going on here? But there's an upper story. There's the story of what God is doing, what God is up to. And what God is always up to is plans of redemption and salvation. And every once in a while, we get to see these beautiful moments where the upper story and the lower story, they come together. And we've been seeing this in Joseph's life. As God has been working on Joseph, transforming his heart, trying to pry his hands off the steering wheel of his life. And maybe it's one finger at a time, but God's been working on him, helping him to always keep a perspective. It's not just the lower story, but to keep a perspective on what God is doing, the upper story. You see, Joseph's joy is based on God. not his circumstances. And so here's the truth. You and I have a lower story. And maybe our lower story is not quite like Joseph's, or maybe our lower story can be compared to Joseph. And the question for us is, are we gonna have the wisdom like Joseph to see what God is doing and trust in him? Because we've seen God working in this guy's life now for over 2 decades as he is transforming and changing Joseph into this incredible man of God. Now, last week where we left off, maybe you remember Pharaoh had 2 dreams, weird dreams. No one could interpret the dreams, and all of a sudden the cupbearer goes, oh, my bad. I forgot about this guy in prison. He's a dream guy, and so they send him for Joseph. They give him a shower and a shave, some new clothes. He comes to the palace before Pharaoh. He interprets the dreams, but he doesn't just interpret the dreams. He gives Pharaoh a plan. And Pharaoh looks at this guy, Joseph, and goes, is there anybody else as wise as this guy? I mean, the Spirit of God is obviously on him. And so Joseph is promoted to the second most powerful man, not just in Egypt, but in the world. And here in this moment, we see how God's timing works. He, in an instant, goes from a prison to the palace. And so just as Joseph predicted, there's 7 years where their crops are abundant, and Joseph builds these Walmarts all across the land of Egypt to store up this grain, and there's more grain than they can count. And as we jump into chapter 42, the 7 years of plenty are over, and now they've entered into the 7 years of famine. And so that's where we pick up as we continue through Genesis, continue through Joseph. Verse 1, chapter 42, listen to what it says. It says, when Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, why are you standing around looking at one another? I mean, isn't that a great dad line right there? Can't you just hear your dad looking and go, what are you doing standing around looking at one another? I mean, that's such a great dad line, but all of a sudden Jacob is brought back into the story of Joseph. And remember, Jacob's great-grandfather was a guy named Abraham. And God came to this guy, Abraham, and said, hey, I'm looking for someone to trust me. I'm looking for someone to partner with me in what I am doing to redeem and reconcile the world and my creation. And Abraham said, I'm in. And so God made a covenant, a promise with Abraham. He said, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna promise you land, I'm gonna promise you offspring, and I'm gonna promise you blessing. And I'm going to bless the entire world through you. And so Abraham has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has a son named Jacob, and Jacob has a son named Joseph. And it's through this line that God is going to bring salvation and redemption to the world, because it's through this line that Jesus will come into the world. And so Joseph has been put in place. Joseph is in Egypt. He's the right guy with the right heart at the right place at the right time for the right reasons for God. And so here we have this moment where this dad looks at his sons and goes, what are you doing standing around? I mean, look around. Do you see the cupboard? The cupboards are empty. I mean, we're eating bologna sandwiches and mac and cheese. Guys, we need some food. And he hears there's some food down to the south. Verse 2, he said, I heard that there is grain in Egypt. So go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we'll die. He's like, guys, there's no food. And there's no hopes of there being more food. Our crops are not producing. There's no way we're going to be able to eat. And so you have got to go to Egypt, which leads me to ask, why hadn't they already gone? I mean, they probably already knew that there was food being grown and food available in Egypt. Why hadn't they gone? Maybe they're afraid of Egypt. I mean, Egypt definitely is the bully on the block. Egypt definitely is different than them with all their different gods. Or maybe, just maybe, these brothers were a little concerned that if they go to Egypt, they might bump into somebody they may not want to see. And so the dad's like, all right, guys, you got to go. We're run out of food. So verse 3 sets this story up. So Joseph's 10 older brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. Say 10. All right, he has 10 older brothers. And so the text is beginning to set up an incredible tension moment in this family, because it was these 10 older brothers who beat Joseph up. It was these 10 older brothers who threw him in a pit. It was these 10 older brothers who sold him into slavery. It's these 10 older brothers who caused him an enormous amount of hurt and pain and trauma in his life. And so the text is setting up some tension. The text is setting up a very awkward family reunion. Now, have you ever showed up at a family event and there's some tension in the room? Like, none of us, right? None of us have ever had that. I mean, you show up at a family event and maybe there's some underlying tension in the family because of an issue that happened last Thanksgiving or last Christmas, or maybe someone said something about somebody, or someone got left out of a family vacation or a family picture, or whatever it is. You show up at this event and you know there's tension in the room. And you can look around the room and everybody's got the fake faces on, smiling like nothing is wrong. Everyone just hoping to keep the peace. Or maybe you're there and you're just waiting. You're waiting for the moment that somebody says something that you're not gonna like, and then it's going to be on. There's gonna be a free-for-all happening in the family. Listen, I don't think that's the case in this family at this moment. Because the truth of the matter is, it's been over 2 decades. And while Joseph has never left the mind of his brothers, he's not on top of their mind. And so I don't think them going to Egypt, they're concerned necessarily about bumping in or running into Joseph. I don't think they're concerned about some weird, awkward family reunion at this point. But the text is beginning to set it up. And so this is what happens as we continue. It says in verse 4, but Jacob wouldn't let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with him for fear some harm might come to him. And so little brother Benjamin stays behind because dad's not about to let him go. Because the last time he let his favorite son go, we know what happened. And so now Joseph has been replaced as the favorite by his little brother Benjamin, because these 2 brothers were the only sons born by Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. And so now Benjamin is staying behind. Dad is not gonna let him go because dad knows his boys. Dad knows his boys. He knows what they're capable of. He's seen what they've been able to do. Remember, Jacob's name means trickster. This is a shady guy, and these apples don't fall far from this tree. And so here's a dad, and he may not know what's going on with his 10 sons, but he knows something is up. I mean, moms and dads, have you ever seen your kids doing something or noticed something in the house, and you're like, hey, what are you doing? Nothing. You're like, no, something's going on. I can sense something's going on. You're up to something. Nothing. Nothing. Right, but you know better. You're like, no, I've been there. I've done this. And like in this situation, you can't con a con. I mean, Jacob knows his boys. He knows their character. He knows they might be up to something, and so he doesn't trust them. And so he is not going to allow his favorite son to go with his boys again, because the last time this happened, he lost his favorite son, Joseph. And so listen to what it says. They go on this journey, verse 5. It says, so Jacob's sons arrived in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. And so what we see at this point is the famine has extended outside of Egypt into this whole region. And so people from all over are coming to buy food, which leads me to wonder, did Joseph wonder in the back of his mind, are my brothers gonna show up? I mean, could he have been thinking in the back of his mind, man, I wonder when they're gonna show up. I wonder when these guys are gonna ride into town. And was he kind of watching out the corner of his eye every day just for that moment? I mean, we don't know. But what we do know is Joseph had built all these Walmarts all across Egypt. And so, I mean, everyone had to come and buy food at this Walmart. And there was only one checkout line and there's only one cashier. Can you imagine the backup in that line? Right? And so everyone was gonna have to come through one line, and everyone was gonna have to see one cashier. And that cashier happened to be Joseph. And so now the story gets interesting. Verse 6, since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. And when they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger, and he spoke harshly to them. Where are you from? He demanded. From the land of Canaan, they replied. We've come to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they don't recognize him. Whoa, what a moment. What an incredible moment where Joseph now is coming face to face with the 10 brothers that put him in a season of 13 years of pain and suffering and heartache. Can you imagine this moment? And they roll into town, they come to this checkout line, and they come face to face with Joseph, and they don't recognize him. I mean, they would never have thought, this is where Joseph is going to be, and Joseph didn't look like Joseph anymore. Joseph looked like an Egyptian. He talked like an Egyptian. He looked like an Egyptian. He walked like an Egyptian. Come on, I had to get that one in there. And so he is fully Egyptian, and his brothers are in no way expecting to see him where he's at or look the way he is. And so they have no clue But Joseph sees them. Now, they may be a little bit older. They may have put on a few pounds. They may have lost some of their hair. Their beard might have been graying a little bit, but Joseph recognizes them. And what is Joseph going to do in this moment? He is now face to face with people, the 10 brothers, who cause him an enormous amount of pain and hurt and trauma in his life. This is his chance because now he has authority. Now he has not just the right, but the power to bring justice to his brothers. And it's time for justice. It's Clint Eastwood style justice, right? Like, wah, wah, wah. I mean, you're gonna get what you deserve. But here's the deal, what would you do in this moment? I mean, if you came face to face with someone who's hurt you, caused you pain and heartache, maybe trauma, what would you do in this moment? I mean, here is Joseph, and he's a new guy. He's not the guy he was back in Genesis 37. He's not the 17-year-old he is anymore. He's a new guy. God has been working on his heart. God has been transforming him and working on his life. Here's a guy that, yes, his lower story has been awful to this point. It has been horrible, but he's been able to keep an eye on what God is doing and what God is trying to do, not just through him, but through a bigger story. And so he's learned to trust God. He's learned to lean into God. He's a new guy, but the moment he sees his 10 brothers, the moment he puts his eyes on them, all that hurt and all that pain and all that trauma comes rushing to the surface. It comes rushing to the surface. I mean, has someone ever hurt you, caused you pain, and all of a sudden you start thinking about that speech you're gonna give them one day? You know that speech that maybe you practice in the shower, or that speech on your way home from work? I mean, you're sitting there and you're thinking about how you're gonna unload on them. You're thinking about all the things you wanna share with them, all the things that you wanna say to them, all that hurt, all that pain. You're like, man, I've got this speech and it's ready to go. And the next time I see them, I'm gonna just unload all this on them. But then you see them and you don't do it. Listen, what's interesting about Joseph, he's not a hero, he's not a villain. I mean, he's just a guy. He's just a dude. He's one of us. He's just trying to navigate life. And here this guy is. I mean, God has obviously transformed him. God has obviously worked in his life. And he's not the same guy he used to be, but now here he is. And he sees his brothers for the first time in 2 decades. These 10 brothers who treat him so horribly and created so much pain and so much trauma in his life. And there's something about trauma that no matter when it happens, it is frozen in time, isn't it? It's just frozen. That trauma you experienced in your life, you can remember the temperature of the room, you can remember the color of the walls, you can remember what you were wearing, you can remember what they were wearing, you can remember the music is playing or what was on TV, you can remember every single word that was said. It's like trauma is frozen in time, and it could have happened 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, 2 years ago, 20 years ago, but you still remember it like it was yesterday. And so here is Joseph. He comes face to face with his brothers, and yes, he's a changed man, but the moment he sees them, he's taken back to that pit, where there he is lying on the ground, looking up and pleading and bleeding, brothers, let me out of here. And what do? They eat lunch. So cold-hearted and calloused. I love what the Bible makes sure to put in there. It says when they showed up for Joseph in his checkout line, what did they do? They bowed down. They bowed down. Well, listen to what happens. The story continues. Verse number 9 says, and he remembered the dreams that he had about them many years ago. Dream where his brothers would one day bow down to him. In that moment, he is seeing this but God moment where you see this upper story and this lower story collide and come together. And he said to them, you are spies. He said, you are spies and you've come to see how vulnerable our land has become. You see, in this moment, God is still working in Joseph. In this moment, God is still doing something in Joseph, because I can only imagine what's running through Joseph's mind at this moment, because he's got one of 2 choices. He now has the power and the authority to dole out justice. Maybe he's thinking, you know what? There's a prison right down the road I'm really familiar with. And maybe I'm just gonna toss these guys in that prison and let them think about things for a while. And maybe while they happen to be in there, they can read some of the things etched in the wall and they might just see their names. He's got the power to punish them, to bring justice, but you know what he also has the power to do? To restore them. Say, hey brothers, guess what? It's me. It's your little brother. Yeah, I know, I don't understand. God does crazy things, but bring it here. Let's hug it out. I mean, he's got the power to either to punish them or to restore them. But as we've seen in Joseph's life, this is a man who's learned wisdom, that God has been transforming him. And so here in this moment, what we see is Joseph comes up with a plan, because what Joseph knows about his life is that over the last 2 decades, God has been transforming him and shaping him and changing him. And so he wants to see, has God done this in my brothers as well? If he did it for me, maybe he's doing it for them. And so here's the reality about forgiveness, because man, let's just be candid about forgiveness. Forgiveness is hard. Forgiveness is just hard. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because forgiveness doesn't mean that everything is just forgotten. Forgiveness doesn't mean that you just kind of pick up where things left off. Forgiveness doesn't mean, hey, we're gonna be best buds again. I mean, that's not what forgiveness means. You see, forgiveness means that I've let go of the bitterness that I've been poisoned by. Forgiveness means that I've let go of the bitterness that I've been poisoned by. And it seems like in Joseph's life that God has been working in his life. God has been teaching him more than just humility. God has been teaching him a little bit about forgiveness. And so he wants to see where his brothers stand. He wants to see how God has changed his brother's life. And so he says, you guys are spies. And their response in verse 10 says, no, my Lord, they exclaimed. Your servants have simply come to buy food. We are all brothers, members of the same family. We are honest men, sir. We are not. Can you imagine when they said those words? Did Joseph chuckle in that moment? I mean, honest men? Seriously? I mean, remember, Joseph doesn't know what happened after he was sold. And there's a lot of questions that Joseph has. What happened when you went back? What did you tell Dad? Was Dad a part of this? Why didn't anybody come looking for me? And so Joseph had a ton of questions. And so listen to what it says in verse 12. Yes, you are spies, Joseph insisted. You've come to see how vulnerable our land has become. Sir, they said, there are actually 12 of us. We, your servants, are all brothers, sons of a man living back in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is back there with our father right now, and one of our brothers is no longer with us. Can you imagine when those words came out of their mouth, how that had to stab the heart of Joseph? Because your translation, or NLT, might say they're no longer with us. Some of your translations might say he's dead. He's dead, because that's how their brothers looked at Joseph. Can you imagine this moment, how difficult this must have been for Joseph as these brothers come back? Now, he's getting some answers. Dad's alive, good. My little brother, Benjamin, he's alive, that's good. But now he confirms it. You guys are not honest men, you're liars. You're liars, and for a few bucks, you sold me off. And then you went back and you told Dad a lie, concocted a story. You guys tossed me aside like a piece of trash. How do you deal with something like that? But here's Joseph dealing with it. Verse 14, Joseph insisted, as I said, you're spies. And so this is how I will test your story. This is how I will know if you're telling me the truth. I swear by the life of Pharaoh that you will never leave Egypt unless your youngest brother comes here. And so now the plot is thickening. And now for some reason, this Egyptian official cares a whole lot about their little brother. Now this is one of the moments in the story, if these brothers would have been paying attention and recognizing a little bit about something's a little bit off here, why does this Egyptian leader care about our little brother? This is like one of those Easter egg moments. It was one of these moments you get to the end of the story, you look back and go, that's what was going on. This is like in a movie where you see something happening in the middle of the movie, you go, that's why he wants a rock hammer. That's why he wants a poster of Raquel Welch. That makes sense. You look back after the fact, this is one of those moments where all of a sudden you recognize, oh my goodness, Joseph is up to something. And his brothers don't have a clue, but Joseph is working a plan. Verse 16, he says, one of you must go and get your brother. I'll keep the rest of you here in prison. Then we'll find out whether your story is true. By the life of Pharaoh, if it turns out that you don't have a younger brother, then I will know you are spies. And so he's testing his brothers. And so verse 17 says, Joseph put them all in prison for 3 days. He let them stew a little bit. He put them in prison to see what was going to happen. He put them in prison to see how they might turn on one another. He wanted to ratchet up the tension a little bit. You ever put your kids in timeout and said, hey, I'm gonna be there in 30 minutes and we're gonna talk about what you've done. And man, they're in their room, they're pacing the room. Oh my gosh, what are they gonna say? What's gonna happen here? Have you ever put multiple kids in timeout together? and listen to their conversations? Oh, it's awesome. My two boys used to love when this happened because they'd be in the room going, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. No, you're the one who did it. I didn't do it. And they're blaming each other. I can only picture that's what's happening in this prison cell. You got these 10 brothers all pointing the fingers at one another going, no, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. It's your fault. As Joseph is just ratcheting up the tension. And so Joseph lets him out, but he changes the game plan a little bit and says, no, instead of sending one of you back, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna keep one of you in prison and let the rest of you go back, because he wants to see how they're gonna treat that one brother. So verse 18, as we continue through, it says, on the third day, Joseph said to them, I'm a God-fearing man. If you do as I say, you will live. If you really are honest men, choose one of your brothers to remain in prison. So the rest of you may go home with grain for your starving families, but you must bring your youngest brother back to me, and this will prove that you're telling the truth, and you will not die. And to this they agreed. And can you imagine these brothers trying to draw straws? Who's gonna stay behind? I mean, with the character we've seen out of them, with the hearts that we've seen out of them. And so Joseph kind of changes the plan up a little bit. And as this whole thing is transpiring, listen to what happens next in verse 21, such a pivotal moment. It says, speaking among themselves, they said, clearly, we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That is why we are in this trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? The big brother Reuben says. But you wouldn't listen, and now we have to answer for his blood. Of course, they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. I mean, again, what a moment. Where here they are in front of their brother Joseph, dressed as this Egyptian, and he's been speaking through an interpreter, and they have no idea that he speaks Hebrew and understands what they're saying. And here in front of them, they're going back and forth, like, guys, I know this is all coming to roost. I mean, what we did to our brother, how we treated our brother, how the awful way we treated our brother, man, this is coming back to bite us. And in this moment, the Bible captures that Joseph's heart is broken in this moment. And in fact, it says in the very next verse, he turned away from them and he began to weep. When he regained his composure, he spoke to them again. And then he chose Simeon from among them and had him tied up right before their eyes. I mean, can you imagine that moment where he overhears his brothers lamenting their guilt of what they did to him, what they did to their brother long ago? And in that moment, he goes, oh, I got something in my contact. He turns around because he doesn't want to see them to see him, crying and weeping in this moment. He composes himself, and then instead of drawing straws, he picks the brother. He says, all right, Simeon, you're coming with me. And he puts him in handcuffs and he hauls him off to prison. And his brothers are just watching all this happen. And Joseph's wanting to see, are they gonna do to Simeon what they did to me? Are they gonna go home to dad and go, hey, Dad, something happened. Got eaten up. He died along the way, whatever, and just forget their brother. What are they going to do? But Joseph is not done turning up the heat on his brothers. Listen to what happens, verse 25. Joseph then ordered his servants to fill the men's sacks with grain. But he also gave secret instructions to return each brother's payment at the top of his sack. And he gave them supplies for their journey home. So the brothers loaded their donkeys with the grain and headed for home. What's Joseph doing? He's giving them their money back? Is Joseph being generous? Absolutely. Is Joseph setting them up? Absolutely. Because they travel. They get to a stopping point, their rest stop along the way. Verse 27 says, when they stopped for the night, and one of them opened his sack to get the grain for his donkey, he found his money in the top of the sack. Look, he exclaimed, my money has been returned. It's here in my sack. Then their hearts sank. Trembling, they said to each other, what has God done to us? This is one of those dun, dun, dun moments. I mean, what has God done to us? Not only are they gonna think we're spies, but now they are gonna think that we are thieves. And so there is no way out of it. There's no way that they can go home to their dad, to Jacob, and tell some lie, tell some story about what's going on. Now they have no choice but to go home and fess up and to share exactly what's happening, because the only recourse, the only way for them to get out of this situation was to take their little brother Benjamin back to Egypt with them. And so Joseph has set up this situation. Joseph has turned up the tension here in this moment. And we are going to see how God is working in his upper story and through our lower stories. Now, a couple questions I have about this. Number one is this. Why didn't Joseph just punish his brothers? Why didn't you just punish? If it's you and me, right? We want justice. And this guy's got the power to bring justice now. It's payback time. You killed my dog. I have a certain set of skills. Let's roll the dice. Let's spin the wheel. Let's see what punishment that you are going to get. And Joseph has every right and the power to do that. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. You see, God has been doing something in Joseph's life. And it wasn't for this upper story that Joseph was able to look to and understand that God was up to something, that God was doing something. Without that upper story, his life would be a nightmare. His life would be a nightmare. So God, where are you? What are you doing? But man, at this point in his life, he has seen God moving. He has seen God working. And God has been transforming him and working in his life. And he may not see what God is fully up to yet. He might not understand the full ramifications of this upper story plan, but what he's seen is I can trust God. I can let go and trust God. And so it seems at this point in the story that Joseph has already learned a little bit about forgiveness. Think about this. Joseph probably had already forgiven several people before his brothers ever arrive. Think about everyone who had to come to Joseph, and he's got a choice every time people show up to Joseph to purchase some grain. Am I going to pay them back, or am I going to restore them? You see, Potiphar probably had to come to Joseph. This guy that he worked for, this guy who falsely accused him, this guy who threw him in prison and forgot about him. He probably had to come and get grain from Joseph. Or how about the cupbearer? The cupbearer who literally said, hey, I won't forget you, buddy, and then immediately forgot him, didn't give him another thought. He had to come and get some grain from Joseph. And so Joseph probably had to learn a little bit about forgiveness along the way before his brothers ever showed up. And so here's this guy Joseph just trying to do the best he can, dealing with this lower story of his life. And it's a mess, and it's filled with all kinds of mixed emotions. And now his brothers show up, the ones that caused him pain and trauma and hurt in his life. And now what is he going to do? What is he going to do? He's going to do the same thing he's learned to do all along the way. He's going to trust the upper story. He's going to trust that God is up to something. And so not only does he decide to let go of this to set himself free, but he decides, I'm going to set my brothers free as well. And so Joseph, I guess, could have punished them, but he doesn't. Here's the second question. Why didn't he just restore them immediately? Why does he concoct this plan? Why does he say, well, let's see what God is up to in these guys' lives? I just want to see if God has transformed them like he's transformed me. Why doesn't he just immediately restore them? You see, I think God's still at work, not just in Joseph's life, but he's in work in his brother's life. And let's just be candid. Forgiveness is so hard. Forgiveness is so hard. They don't always deserve it. They've hurt you. They may not even care. They may not even know, and so they're definitely not even sorry. And so many times forgiveness is not about the other person. Forgiveness is about you. You see, forgiveness is that moment in time where we realize that somebody has done something to hurt us, that caused pain in our life, and we recognize that they deserve something, that they deserve justice, but it's not mine to give them. It's not mine to give them. Because here's the reality, if we're not careful, unforgiveness will take over our lives. And unforgiveness is a poison that fills our hearts and spreads through our soul. Unforgiveness is a poison that just spreads through our hearts and our souls. And you can say, you know what, I'm never gonna forgive them. I'm never gonna let this go. They're gonna get what they deserve. But the reality is they still have control of your life. That hurt and that pain that you've not let go of, it's still controlling your life. And the only way that we can let go of that is we give it to God. And we say, God, I'm giving you this hurt. I'm giving you this pain. I'm giving you this person in my life. Because if not, I'm going to see my life absolutely consumed. I'm going to see my relationships absolutely consumed with the poison of bitterness and unforgiveness. Listen, sometimes forgiveness is difficult. And let me be clear on what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not an excuse for sin. Forgiveness is not turning your back on justice. Forgiveness is not whitewashing your hurt and your pain and your trauma. Forgiveness is not conditional. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is not trust. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. It may or it may not come. Forgiveness is simply saying, I will not let the hurt that you caused me to poison me anymore. Forgiveness is setting yourself free. I mean, forgiveness is relinquishing your right to vengeance for the sake of your freedom. And here's the reality. You've probably all bumped into somebody that's got some bitterness in their heart. Maybe it's at work, maybe it's at school, maybe it's out in the community, maybe it's at a family get-together, but you bump into that person that is just consumed with bitterness, someone who's consumed with unforgiveness, and you go, how are you doing? You ask that question, and oh boy, do you get it. I mean, it's like, oh, I can't believe this person, can't believe what they said, can't believe what they did, can't believe how they treated me. And the next thing you know, for the next 5, 10, 15 minutes, they just unload all of this bitterness all over you. They're barfing bitterness on you. And yes, that's an awful picture, but isn't that what it feels like? Because you walk away from that moment, you're like, oh man. I mean, all that bitterness and all that unforgiveness, it's just yuck. Yuck. And it's in those moments we realize that that's not what Jesus taught us to do. That's not how Jesus taught us to live. He taught us another way. And so what we see here in the life of Joseph is that Joseph was onto something, and Joseph learned something, and Joseph learned a little bit about forgiveness on this journey. His 13 years in that pit in prison, it wasn't just about his humility. God was growing something in him so that he had the ability to forgive, and not just forgive, but forgive like Jesus taught us to forgive. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. The Bible says, as far as it depends on you, live at peace. Jesus says that we're supposed to forgive, not one time, but 7 times 77. And Jesus also tells us that those people that we don't feel like deserve our forgiveness, yeah, we're supposed to forgive them too. It was Jesus in that Sermon on the Mount that says, if you forgive those who sin against you, then your heavenly Father will forgive you. He will forgive you. And so let me ask you this question as we wrap up our time together here. Do you have a list? Are you keeping a list? Maybe you haven't written it down on paper, or maybe you haven't kept it in your notes on your phone, but you've got a list. That boss at work, coworker, an ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, ex-wife, ex-husband, mom, dad, brother, sister, best friend, someone online. Are you keeping a list? And are you allowing that bitterness, are you allowing that unforgiveness to just grow in you and to take over your heart and take over your soul? Are you practicing that speech where you're just gonna give them what they deserve? Listen, it might make you feel good, but it's not gonna do any good. And so do you have a list? And maybe if you have a list, maybe the first step you need to take with dealing with that list is just go to God and say, God, I just need to give it to you. I need to give you this person. I need to give you this hurt. Sometimes just identifying it. Identifying the person, identifying the hurt is the beginning of this process of God restoring our hearts and removing that bitterness and unforgiveness from us. And just going to God and say, God, I gotta be real. And maybe I haven't recognized it, maybe I haven't admitted it, maybe I've been in denial, but the reality is I've got this bitterness in me and it's consuming my life, and I'm not so sure if I don't just stop it now that it's not gonna wreck my marriage. I'm not so sure, Jesus, if I don't do something about it now, it's gonna wreck all of my relationships. Jesus, I'm not so sure if I don't deal with it now, it's gonna wreck my relationship with you. So do you have a list? And listen, I know some of these go way back. And I know some of the hurt is really, really deep. It doesn't mean that the moment you go give them a name and say, give this to Jesus, it's just immediately gonna be gone. It begins a process. It just begins a process of finding that freedom that Jesus offers us. And listen, I'm not trying to minimize your hurt. I don't want to minimize your pain. I don't want to minimize your trauma. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is don't let that define you. Don't let that bitterness consume your heart and move through your body, because it's like a cancer that'll just take over every inch of your heart and your soul and your body. Listen, I know, and there's so many times I got a name or two on my list, and I got to go to God and go, God, I can't do this on my own. God's like, you're right. You can't, Jason. You need me. You need me. And that's why we need to remember, we need Jesus. We can't do this without Jesus. We can't do this without the power of the Holy Spirit working in us to transform our hearts. We can't do this without recognizing our state. We got to recognize the forgiveness that we've been given. What you and I deserved was death. Punishment for our sin. Punishment for what we've done wrong, but that's not what we were given. We didn't earn it, we didn't deserve it, but Jesus gave his life on the cross to forgive you and me. So my question to you is, do you have a list? And maybe today, God is inviting you here into this place to begin some work, to do some work, and maybe like Joseph, to begin to learn that, it's not my place to bring justice, it's God's. And if I'm gonna be who God needs me to be and created me to be, then I gotta get out of this prison of unforgiveness, and I gotta take my hands off the wheels and let God nudge me back into the right way of living. And maybe that's what today is. Maybe God's got you here to just nudge you, to just shake you a little bit and go, hey, that bitterness, it's a poison. You need to do something about it before it wrecks your life. And so I know this is one of those moments where some of you are going, you know what, that's good for everybody else, I'm good. Pastor, I'm good. Listen, I think this is good for everybody, and maybe we all just need to simply say the prayer of King David in Psalm 39. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and Lord, lead me in the way everlasting. This is as we wrap up our time together here. Do you have a list? And has God brought you here today to nudge you back into the right lane, to help you to let go of the control of everything in your life and trust that this upper story, what God is doing, is he's working not just for everybody, but he's working for your benefit as well. And to give him that hurt, give him that pain, so you can find the freedom that Jesus has given to you. Would you pray with me? Jesus, we recognize how difficult this one is and how needed this is, because so many of us go through life and we bump into people who are like us, not perfect, broken, got issues, got things happening at home that kind of filter out at work. Things are happening at work that are filtering out at home. We got our own personalities and our own challenges, our own inner battles with our own sins. And you wrap all that up together and put us in a room, and yeah, there's gonna be conflict. There's gonna be some hurt and there's gonna be some pain. And so Jesus, right now we come and we just wanna confess that to you. That we have hurt and we have pain and there is trauma in our life. And Jesus, we also wanna just repent of the fact that we try to do things our way. And we haven't lived out what you've taught us to do and how you taught us to live and how you taught us to forgive. And so Jesus, would you forgive us for our lack of forgiveness? And would you begin to change our hearts as you changed the heart of Joseph? As Joseph was confronted with 10 of his brothers that hurt him and created so much trauma in his life. I mean, how was he able to muster up forgiveness in that moment? Jesus, I pray that you will work in our lives, that you'll let the Holy Spirit just do what only the Holy Spirit can do, is to transform us into the disciple that you have called us and created us to be. And so Jesus, right now, we just want to give you a name. We want to give you some pain. We want to give you a hurt. We want to let go of control of those things and give it to you. So in the quiet of this moment, hear that name, hear that hurt. Jesus, we want to be set free. So would you begin the process of healing our broken hearts? Would you begin the process of removing the venom of bitterness from our souls? And would you help us to live as you've called us to live, forgiving others as you have forgiven us? Jesus, we can't do this without you. We desperately need you. And so less of us and more of you. Jesus, we pray this in your name. Amen.